You're a dead man, Victor.
Kangmin Jae had built an empire on the gospel of Messi, patience, precision, the quiet kind of greatness. Victor Han worshipped Ronaldo's swagger like scripture. Neither man expected the World Cup to end with a kidnapping instead of a trophy ceremony. If you believe patience beats arrogance, and quiet men like Kangmin Jae always outlast loud frauds like Victor Han, hit like and subscribe right now. Only the Victor Hans of the world, the fakes who mock loyalty and steal what they can't earn, would scroll past this story without subscribing. Soul doesn't sleep. It just changes which kind of danger is awake. At 2 a.m. in a private room above a barbecue restaurant that officially served meat and unofficially served silence, Kangmin Jae sat with his tie loosened and his composure fastened tight, watching a room full of dangerous men argue about a game played by 22 people who would never know their names. This was, somehow, the most honest room in the city. Everyone in it had killed a business, if not a person, to get here. And every single one of them still believed, with the fierce, undignified passion of a boy at his first match, that football mattered. Min Jae mattered more than most. He ran the docks, which meant he ran what came into Korea and, more importantly, what conveniently disappeared once it arrived. He ran 3 judges the way other men ran errands. Fear, in his hands, was a scalpel. Quiet, precise, and rarely shown to the patient. But there was exactly one subject that made the ice in his voice melt into something almost human. Lionel Messi. To the men who worked for him, this was baffling. Min Jae could order a debt collected with the emotional range of a man requesting extra rice. But mention a 5'7" Argentine who'd spent a decade getting doubted, benched, written off, and betting market mocked before finally clawing his way to the top of the world. And something in Kangmin Jae's jaw would unclench. Small men who wait, he liked to say, very loud men who don't. His enemies had learned this the hard way. His football rivals had not learned it at all. Which brings us to Victor Han, a man who ran his empire the way he ran his mouth, loudly, expensively, and with absolutely zero interest in subtlety. Victor didn't do patience. Victor did entrances. He arrived at meetings the way influencers arrive at premieres, trailing cologne and confidence, and at least 2 men whose entire job description was, look impressed. Victor worshipped Cristiano Ronaldo the way other men worship stock portfolios, because it was undefeated, because it was polished, because it photographed beautifully from every angle. If Min Jae collected loyalty like a slow, patient investment, Victor collected admiration the way a nightclub collects a cover charge, loudly at the door from everyone. Their rivalry had survived 3 police chiefs, 1 minor turf war, and roughly 4,000 unbearable group chats. So when Victor slammed his glass down in that smoke-fogged private room and laughed that Min Jae's pride would die the moment Ronaldo lifted the World Cup, the room didn't laugh with him. Mafia men don't make casual bets. They make blood oaths with better tailoring. If Messi wins, Min Jae said, not loudly, because volume was for men who needed to be believed, you surrender every business you've stolen from families too scared to fight back. Victor grinned like a man who'd already won the argument, the tournament, and possibly the concept of football itself. The next morning, a box arrived at Min Jae's mansion. Inside it, a crisp, folded Ronaldo jersey, and a note that read, in Victor's absurdly ornate handwriting, get used to the color. Another box came the next day, and the next. A psychological siege waged entirely in cotton and polyester, one smug delivery at a time, as if humiliation could be shipped express. Inside that mansion, a woman named Amara watched the boxes accumulate in the hallway with the calm, faintly amused patience of someone married to a dangerous man who had, somehow, married up in the humanity department. Amara hadn't cared much about football before Min Jae. She cared about the way his voice softened, talking about a kid from Rosario who got told he was too small, too quiet, too easily overlooked, and became the best anyway. That story, she realized, wasn't really about football. It was about her husband's entire philosophy of survival, worn cleverly in shin guards. She had no idea yet that Victor's jerseys weren't really a joke. She had no idea that somewhere on Victor's side of the city, a countdown had already started, one that had nothing to do with penalty kicks and everything to do with her. Victor Han did not believe in slow burns. Victor believed in bonfires, the kind you could see from 3 districts away, the the kind that made people whisper his name at dinner tables he'd never been invited to. So when Argentina stumbled in the group stage, losing a match nobody expected them to lose, Victor didn't just celebrate. He broadcasted it. By morning, every Mafia group chat in Seoul had the same meme, a tiny cartoon, Messi crying into a tiny cartoon jersey, captioned, "Small men cry big tears." Victor's people forwarded it to Min Jae's people, who forwarded it to Min Jae himself. Because in the underworld, plausible deniability died the moment somebody hit send with a laughing emoji attached. Min Jae read the message once. He did not laugh. He did not frown. He simply set his phone face down on the table, the way a man sets down a losing hand of cards he knows, somehow, is about to become a winning one. "They think losing once means it's over," he said to Amara that evening, watching replays with the focus other men reserve for balance sheets. Victor's whole life is the highlight reel. He's never had to watch the boring part, the part where you get back up. Amara curled into the couch beside him, a woman who had learned, 3 years into this marriage, that the safest place in Seoul was directly beside the calmest man in it. "And you have?" she asked. "I built docks out of the parts of this city nobody wanted," Min Jae said. "I have watched every boring part there is." It wasn't romance exactly, but for a man like Min Jae, it was practically a sonnet. Argentina won their next match, then the next. Each victory peeled back another layer of Victor's confidence, like sunburned skin, revealing something raw and unattractive underneath. Panic, dressed up as swagger, the way a man in serious debt still buys around for the table. Victor's jersey deliveries to Min Jae's mansion slowed from daily to occasional to non-existent, which told Amara more than any spreadsheet could have. Bullies don't go quiet because they've made peace. They go quiet because they're recalculating. And Victor had a lot to recalculate. Losing this bet didn't just mean losing pride. Pride was cheap, replaceable, the kind of currency you could rebuild with a good tailor and a louder car. Losing meant surrendering territory, real estate, laundering fronts, the extortion routes that funded the empire Victor had built entirely on the idea that he was, and always would be, undefeated. Take away undefeated from a man like Victor, and you didn't just take his business. You took the only identity he'd ever bothered building, which is precisely why desperate men start doing things careful men never would. Victor's lieutenant, a quiet, watchful man named Jung-ho, noticed it first. The late-night calls Victor took in rooms he suddenly needed locked. The new faces cycling through his crew, men whose only skill appeared to be silence. Jung-ho had spent 11 years absorbing Victor's contempt in exchange for a loyalty that was never, not once, repaid in kind. He'd watched Victor take credit for other men's work, watched him humiliate people in meetings for sport, watched him worship a footballer's brand while treating actual human beings like disposable props in his own highlight reel. Jung-ho didn't say anything. Men like Jung-ho rarely did, not until the moment saying something mattered. Meanwhile, across the city, Min Jae's confidence had quietly calcified into something Amara had never seen in him before. Certainty. Not the loud kind Victor wore like cologne, but the kind that lived underneath the skin, in the specific stillness of a man who has done the math and likes the answer. "He's going to do something," Amara said one night, watching Min Jae review the tournament bracket with the intensity of a general studying enemy terrain. "He already is," Min Jae said. "He just doesn't know I can see it." Outside, Seoul buzzed with World Cup fever. Flags in windows, arguments in bars, strangers bonding and breaking over 90-minute battles that meant everything and, technically, nothing at all. Somewhere in that noise, two empires were quietly recalculating their futures based on the footwork of two men who would never meet either boss, never know their names, never understand that an entire criminal underworld had staked its future on which one of them lifted a trophy first. Argentina advanced to the semifinals. And somewhere in Victor Hahn's mansion, a decision was made that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with making sure that if Victor was going to lose, he wasn't going to lose alone. Argentina's semifinal win didn't just silence the group chats, it detonated them. Victor watched the final whistle from his private box, usually his throne, tonight his witness stand. Surrounded by men who had spent months mocking Messi's washed legs and were now studying their phones with the specific silence of gamblers watching a horse they'd bet against cross the finish line first. Nobody made eye contact with Victor. In his world, that silence was louder than any insult Min Jae could have delivered in person. He smiled anyway. Victor always smiled. It was, Jung Ho had come to realize over 11 years of employment, the most dangerous thing about him. The smile arrived exactly when the math stopped working. 2 more wins, Victor said, swirling a drink he hadn't touched, and I lose an empire to a man who thinks patience is a personality. You could concede early, Jung Ho offered, not because he expected Victor to take it, but because someone in the room needed to say the same thing out loud, if only for the historical record. Cut losses. Rebuild somewhere Min Jae's name doesn't reach. Victor's laugh had teeth in it. Rebuild. You say that like I'm a house that burned down. I'm not rebuilding anything, Jung Ho. I'm reminding people what I already own. That sentence sat wrong in Jung Ho's chest for the rest of the night, the way a splinter sits wrong under skin. Small, easy to ignore, impossible to forget entirely. He'd absorbed a decade of Victor's contempt disguised as mentorship. Watched him claim credit for deals Jung Ho closed alone. Watched him treat every person under him as a supporting actor in the movie, where Victor always, obviously, triumphantly won. Jung Ho had told himself for years that loyalty was patience with better manners. Sitting in that box, watching Victor talk about reminding people what he owned like Amara was already inventory, Jung Ho felt the splinter go deeper. Across the city, Min Jae read the semifinal score off his phone with the same expression he used for reviewing shipping manifests. Mild interest in a process he already trusted. Amara curled beside him with 2 mugs of tea neither of them had touched. Watched him more than she watched the highlights. You're not celebrating, she said. Celebrating is for people who were surprised, Min Jae said. I wasn't surprised. You're never surprised. It's deeply annoying. It's why I'm still alive. She laughed. The real kind, not the performance she'd learned to give at his business dinners. And for a moment, the mansion felt less like the headquarters of a criminal empire and more like a home 2 people had actually built together. It was, Amara thought, the strange gift of loving a dangerous man. The danger stayed mostly outside the walls, and inside them, you got quiet nights and bad jokes, and a husband who explained football like it was philosophy, because, to him, it was. She didn't know Victor had already made his decision. She didn't know that somewhere across Seoul, a van had been rented under a name that didn't exist, that 2 men she'd never met had begun quietly memorizing her schedule. The market on Tuesdays, the gym before 9. The driver Min Jae insisted on that Victor's people had already, patiently, learned to anticipate and route around. Reflection for you, watching at home. Victor Han built his entire life on being undefeated, and the moment that title was threatened, he didn't examine himself. He reached for the nearest innocent person to burn instead. How many people in your own life mistake control for strength the second they're actually challenged? Type your answer below. And if you've ever watched someone like Victor unravel the second real accountability showed up, hit like and subscribe. Only the enablers, the ones who'd rather protect a bully's ego than an innocent person's safety, would scroll past this without doing both. The night before the final, Victor sat alone in his office long after his men had gone home, staring at a photograph of Amara that had cost him more to obtain than most of his business deals. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself often. Second-guessing was for men who hadn't already decided they were right, but some small, unfamiliar part of him, the part that hadn't spoken up in years, the part he'd buried under cologne and confidence and championship photos of a man he'd never met, asked a quiet question he didn't have a good answer for. What exactly are you planning to do if Messi actually wins? Victor poured another drink instead of answering it. By morning, Amara was gone. Min Jae woke at 6:47 a.m. A habit older than his marriage, older than the empire. A soldier's instinct that survived long after the war that built it. He reached across the bed out of pure reflex, the way a man checks his own pulse without thinking about it. The sheets were cold. He didn't panic. Panic was inefficient, and inefficiency in Min Jae's world got people killed. He walked the mansion the way he walked a business he already suspected was compromised, methodically, room by room, cataloging what was wrong before he let himself feel anything about it. Amara's phone, charging on the nightstand. Her shoes by the door, all of them, which meant she hadn't chosen to leave barefoot into a Seoul morning. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, no struggle at all. which was, somehow, so much worse than if there had been one. A struggle meant Amara had fought. A struggle meant someone had made a mistake. The absence of struggle meant whoever had taken her had planned this the way Minjae planned everything. Patiently, invisibly, and long before anyone noticed the countdown had started. His phone rang at 7:03. One bar of signal, a blocked number, and a voice that didn't need to introduce itself. "Good morning," Victor said, and the horror of it was how normal he sounded, like a man calling about a lunch reservation, not a life. "I assume you've noticed your wife isn't making tea this morning." Minjae said nothing. Silence in his world was a weapon he'd sharpened for 20 years. "You don't have to talk," Victor continued, unbothered. "You just have to listen. Watch the final if you want. I know you will. You can't help yourself. But every minute your little Argentine boys get closer to that trophy is another minute your wife gets farther away from you. Think of it as a countdown with two clocks. One's on television. The other one's mine." "Where?" Minjae said. Just the one word. It cost him more than the entire empire. "That's the fun part," Victor said. And Minjae could hear the smile, could hear a man who'd spent his whole life confusing cruelty for cleverness. "You're going to find out the way you find out everything, Minjae. Slowly, piece by piece. I hope you like scavenger hunts." The line went dead. Minjae stood in the empty bedroom for exactly 4 seconds. The only 4 seconds of stillness the rest of that day would afford him. And then he became something his own men had only heard about in the stories older employees told the newer ones. Not the calm boss, not the patient investor collecting loyalty like slow interest. Something underneath all of that. Something the docs and the judges and the 20 years of careful reputation building had always been quietly protecting. He called 6 people in 90 seconds. Not for comfort, for information. The first clue arrived within the hour, delivered, with Victor's signature flourish for theater, to a memorabilia shop Minjae's organization had used for years to launder cash through overpriced signed shirts nobody actually wanted. Taped to the door, a Ronaldo jersey, and beneath it, a note in handwriting too neat to belong to a man in any real hurry. "Warmer already. Keep watching the match. It helps you understand the stakes." Minjae tore the jersey down without reading it twice. Somewhere across the city, a whistle blew, and 90 minutes of history began without him. He didn't watch a single minute of the first half. He was too busy tearing through the sealed stadium tunnels Victor's organization used for meetings men wanted forgotten, too busy leaning on informants who suddenly remembered things once they understood exactly whose wife was missing. Every clue was smaller and crueler than the last. A scarf tied to a key, a betting slip with an address scrawled on the back. Football turned into a cruel little game that treated Amara's life like a prize at the end of a Ronaldo-branded riddle. At halftime, Argentina led 1-0. Minjae didn't know it. He was 3 neighborhoods away, standing in an abandoned betting house that owed Victor more debt than dignity, staring at a final address scrawled on the back of a photograph of his own wife, a photograph he hadn't known existed, taken from an angle that meant someone had been watching her for weeks. The fireworks hadn't started yet, but somewhere in Seoul, 2 clocks were ticking toward the same finish line, and only one of them cared about a trophy. The second half started the way most second halves do, with everyone in Seoul suddenly remembering they had opinions about football again. Bars refilled. Strangers hugged strangers. A city built on hierarchy and fear briefly forgot both, united by 22 men chasing a ball on a field 4,000 miles away. Minjae stood in an abandoned betting house that hadn't taken a legal wager in a decade, holding a photograph of his wife he wished he'd never had to see, and felt Seoul's joy arrive through the walls like weather he wasn't invited to. A television bolted above the old counter, left behind by whoever ran this place before Victor's people gutted it for parts, played the match to an empty room, the volume low, the commentary tinny and distant. He didn't turn it off. He needed the clock. It was the only honest thing left in the building. The photograph told him 2 things. First, it had been taken from the rooftop across from the market Amara visited every Tuesday, meaning Victor's surveillance predated this entire final by weeks, possibly months, meaning this was never a spontaneous act of a panicking man, but a plan built with the same patience Victor claimed, loudly and often, that he didn't have. Second, on the back, in that same unbearably neat handwriting, Old Stadium, Gate 7, Bring your patience. You'll need it more than your gun. Min-jae didn't bring his gun. He brought both hands empty and his mind fuller than it had ever been. The old stadium had been sealed for 10 years, ever since a match-fixing scandal turned it into a monument nobody wanted to remember. Victor's organization used the maintenance tunnels beneath it the way other men use storage units, to keep things nobody was supposed to find. Min-jae moved through corridors that smelled like rust and old rain, past murals of players nobody cheered for anymore, guided only by the sound of a television leaking through a door left slightly open, playing a match to an audience of one. Argentina scored again. Somewhere above ground, Seoul screamed loud enough to rattle old glass. Below ground, Min-jae found Dong-ho standing outside a locked door with an expression that didn't belong to a loyal lieutenant. It belonged to a man doing long division on his own life and arriving finally at an answer he didn't like. "She's inside," Jung-ho said, before Min-jae could ask, before Min-jae could do anything violent with the question. "She's fine. He hasn't touched her." Victor likes to win, Min-jae. He doesn't know how to just take. Min-jae studied him the way he studied every stranger who suddenly offered him something valuable for free, with suspicion first, curiosity second. "Why are you telling me this?" Jung-ho's laugh had no humor in it at all. 11 years, he said. 11 years I built this man's empire with my own hands. And the day he actually needed loyalty, you know what he called me? Insurance. Said if this whole thing fell apart, I'd be the name on the paperwork. Not him. Me. He shook his head. I've spent a decade watching him take credit for other men's patience. I'm done pretending that's the same thing as respect. Above them, the crowd noise swelled again. Another chance. Another near miss. The specific agony of a nation collectively holding its breath. "Open the door," Min-jae said. Jung-ho didn't move yet. "Before I do, you should know. She didn't wait for you." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. "She's not tied to a chair in there crying, if that's what you pictured. You married someone who doesn't do that." Min-jae felt something in his chest shift. Not relief exactly. Not yet. But the specific feeling of a man realizing the story he'd been telling himself for the last 12 hours might not be the one that mattered. The final whistle hadn't blown yet. Somewhere above them, 90 minutes were bleeding into stoppage time, and the whole of Seoul stood on the edge of history. Down here, in a sealed tunnel underneath the stadium, nobody cheered in anymore. Jung-ho finally turned the key. The door swung open, and Min-jae's first instinct, the one built over 20 years of walking into rooms where violence had already happened, was to brace for wreckage. A tied chair. A frightened woman. Something to be angry about. Something to burn down on the way out. What he found instead was Amara sitting calmly at a folding table, a cup of tea in front of her that someone had clearly made for her without being asked twice, and a phone in her hand that did not belong to her. "You took your time," she said, and the sheer normalcy of her voice hit Min-jae harder than any scream could have. "I was starting to think Argentina was going to finish before you did." He crossed the room in 3 strides, and she stood to meet him. And for one full second, neither of them said anything, because some reunions don't need commentary. They just need to happen. Then Amara, being Amara, pulled back first, because there was still work to do, and she had never once in her life confused relief with the end of a job. "He didn't hurt you," Min-jae said. Not quite a question. "He didn't have the nerve to," Amara said. "Victor's the kind of man who needs an audience to be cruel." Alone in a locked room, all he had was a monologue about undefeated legacies and how Ronaldo never needed anyone to believe in him. I let him talk. Men like that always talk themselves into the mistake that gets them caught. She turned the phone in her hand toward Min-jae. Jung-ho's phone, it turned out, handed over hours earlier once Jung-ho decided which side of 11 years of contempt he was finally willing to stand on. On the screen, financial records, wire transfers, a decade of skimmed profits Victor had routed through shell accounts with Jung-ho's name quietly attached to every one of them. Insurance, exactly as Jung-ho had said, a fall guy built in advance for a collapse Victor had always secretly expected. "He's been building a parachute out of another man's back for years," Amara said. "I didn't wait to be rescued, Min-jae. I spent the last 12 hours making sure that when you did show up, you'd be walking into a war Victor had already lost, whether or not a football match ever happened." It was, Min-jae thought, the single most attractive sentence his wife had ever said to him, and he had heard her negotiate hostile takeovers. Above them, Muffled through concrete and a decade of stadium neglect, the noise of the city cracked open, a roar too massive to be anything but history. Somewhere, 90 minutes plus stoppage time had ended, and Lionel Messi had done the one thing louder men had spent a career insisting he never would. Min-jae didn't need to check a score. He'd built an entire philosophy on knowing what patience sounds like when it finally gets paid. Footsteps echoed down the tunnel behind them, fast, uneven. A man who'd clearly heard the same roar and understood, with the sudden mathematical clarity of the truly desperate, exactly what it meant for his empire. Victor Hahn arrived expecting a broken rival standing over a frightened hostage. He found his own lieutenant standing calmly beside a woman who was very clearly not afraid, holding a phone that contained 11 years of Victor's crimes with someone else's name stapled to the cover. Victor's smile, the one he wore like cologne, the one that had never once failed him in a room, did not arrive. "This isn't," he started. "It's exactly what it looks like," Jung-ho said quietly. "I just finally decided whose side I was actually on." Fireworks began somewhere above the old stadium's broken roof, lighting cracks in the concrete like a city trying to remind itself that joy still existed. Messi had lifted the trophy the world had waited a lifetime for. And Victor Hahn, for the first time in his entire undefeated life, had absolutely nothing left to say. Victor Hahn had built his entire identity on being the loudest man in every room he entered. Standing in that stadium tunnel, watching his own lieutenant hand his crimes to his rival like a receipt, Victor discovered, for the first time in his adult life, what silence actually felt like when it wasn't a weapon he was choosing to use. "Say something," Min-jae said quietly. Not a taunt. An invitation, almost generous in its cruelty. Because Min-jae had learned decades ago that the worst thing you could do to a man who lived for an audience was let him watch himself fail in front of one. Victor's mouth opened. Nothing loud enough for a highlight reel came out. "You kidnapped my wife over a football bet," Min-jae continued, stepping closer, his voice never once rising. Because rage that needs volume isn't real rage, it's performance. And Victor had spent his whole career mistaking the two. "You didn't do it because you believed in Ronaldo. You did it because you never believed in yourself without an audience clapping. That's the difference between us, Victor. I built patience into an empire. You built an empire on borrowed applause, and the second the applause got quiet, you reached for the nearest innocent person to make noise with instead." Amara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply held up Jung-ho's phone, the screen still glowing with 11 years of Victor's laundered guilt wearing another man's name, and let the evidence do what evidence always does, better than emotion: end an argument permanently. "Jung-ho," Victor said, finally finding a word, though it came out smaller than he intended, "you're going to regret this." "I regretted the first 9 years," Jung-ho said. "The last two, I was just waiting for a reason good enough to act on it. Turns out the reason was a woman who never asked me to save her. She just gave me a chance to save myself." Above ground, Seoul had turned into a single, unbroken celebration. Flags waved from car windows, strangers embracing on street corners, a whole city temporarily forgetting hierarchy, fear, and football rivalries in favor of pure, uncomplicated joy. Messi had done what small, doubted, endlessly written off men do when the world finally stops looking away. He had made history quietly, on his own patient terms, exactly the way Min-jae had always insisted greatness actually worked. Down in the tunnel, Victor's empire collapsed with far less fanfare. There was no dramatic gunfight, no explosion, no cinematic reckoning. Because men like Victor don't get to go out with the highlight reel they always believed they deserved. They go out the way they built everything. On paperwork, on debts finally called in, on the specific unglamorous justice of records nobody can argue with. Within the week, every business Victor had stolen from innocent families, as Min-jae once put it before a room full of witnesses, changed hands, not seized by force, but surrendered in writing, the way a blood oath with better tailoring always eventually gets paid. Jung-ho didn't ask for territory. He asked for something rarer in that world, a clean start. And Min-jae, who understood better than most men alive what loyalty was actually worth once you'd finally seen it in its purest form, gave it to him without hesitation. That night, back in the mansion that had, 12 hours earlier, felt like the scene of an unsolved crime. Min-jae and Amara sat together in the quiet the way they always had. Before any of this, tea gone cold, television murmuring replays of a final neither of them had actually watched live, and somehow that felt right. They hadn't needed the match. They'd needed each other, and they both, in their own ways, refused to wait around for rescue that hadn't been earned. You know, Amara said, leaning into him, you never actually finished explaining what you love so much about Messi. Minjay considered this the way he considered everything, slowly, without needing to be believed quickly. He got told he was too small for this game his whole life, he said finally. Everyone loud enough to matter said so. He didn't argue. He just kept showing up until the argument became embarrassing to make. Amara smiled, the exhaustion of the day finally settling into something softer. Sounds like someone I married. Patience always collects, Minjay said. And for the first time all day, it sounded less like a threat and more like a promise already kept. Outside, fireworks kept lighting up a city that had no idea how close its biggest football night had come to becoming something else entirely, and how, in a sealed tunnel under a stadium, nobody cheered in anymore. The real final had already been won by the people who refused to stop believing when the lights went dark.